Hello, everyone. I'm James Harkins, host of This Week in Texas History, a weekly show that is part of the Save Texas History program. Save Texas History is brought to you by Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office. If you love our state's history and want to make sure that it lasts forever, please visit savetexashistory.org and consider making a tax-deductible donation. Hello, I'm here today with James P. Bevill, who is an expert on many different aspects of money. He is the past president of the Texas Numismatic Association, and he's been elected as an honorary member of the Sons of the Republic of Texas for his contributions to the history of the money and the economy of the Republic of Texas. He has spent his career in financial services since graduating magna cum laude from the University of Houston at Clear Lake in 1983, and he is currently at UBS. Today, Jim will be discussing the Paper Republic, the struggle for money, credit, and independence in the Republic of Texas, which was released by Bright Sky Press in 2009. It also happens to be one of my favorite Texas history books. As Jim says in his introduction, when doing an investigation, and this time into Texas history, just follow the money and you'll find the truth. And Jim does a fantastic job of explaining the importance of money in this book and finds the truth. So Jim, thank you for being here.
Glad to be with you guys. Thank you.
So you're a prominent member of the Texas Numismatic Association. Can you talk a little bit about that organization, your role, and how you got involved? And how exactly did you start studying the history of money?
I started studying money. I hold a BS in finance with honors from the University of Houston at Clear Lake. But collecting is, in regards to collecting paper money, when you're the president, and this was a long time ago, but I was the president of a statewide organization of collectors. These are people that collected coins and paper money primarily, and other stuff as well, autographs and things like that. When you hang out with other collectors, you see what they get to collect. If you're a car collector, you know other people that collect cars. If you're a coin collector, you know other people that collect the same types of genre of coins. I got to know other collectors that collected a lot of Republic of Texas money. And as I started buying some of that stuff, some private Texas pieces for my collection, I noticed that some were issued from different cities: Houston, Velasco, Columbia, Washington. I didn't know where Washington was. I've heard of Washington, Nebraska, but not Washington. I knew that Velasco was a port, but I didn't know where it was. I didn't know where Columbia was, which is today's West Columbia, Texas. So there wasn't really any place that I could go to look that up.
Did you develop your interest for Texas history, I guess, early on whenever you were collecting historical money, or did that kind of develop later on? Which came first?
And well, for the record, that's a good question. And that was actually, one of your later questions at the end. I remember looking through my notes, and I actually began an interest in Texas history in my fourth grade Texas history class at May Smith Elementary School in Pasadena. I remember the teacher looking at her watch and saying, "The battle starts now." And she kept talking about this and this and this. And she said, 18 minutes have passed. We just defeated the Mexican army. I still remember that 50 years later. Just clear as day, the classroom, looking out the windows and all that. But I think that's where it started. And I hope that history keeps being taught to elementary school and junior high students.
So I think with a common theme that I'm hearing from you and some of the other guests that we've had is it started with a good teacher, which is one of the reasons that here at the GLO we so actively try to work with teachers and the education community to get primary resources into the classroom so students have access to maps or historic documents or whatever it might be. I think we even brought a rifle from the Alamo to a class one time. So it's something to remember, is that history really kind of starts with the teachers and the primary resources that we're lucky enough to work with.
Absolutely, but that's kind of where it started.
So whenever you decided to write this book, The Paper Republic, what were you thinking? Why did you think that this was the book that needed to be written?
You kind of back into that. I was originally had a bunch of friends, let's say a handful of friends, and we were going to put together this exhibit on Texas money and it was going to go in the Alamo in San Antonio because we had heard they were going to build a new exhibit space inside the gift shop. So I sent some of this to Bruce Winders and David Stewart, who are the curator and the director of the Alamo complex at that time. And so we set up a meeting. We had a meeting in the office, and we went to lunch afterwards. And I showed him all these different pieces, and I said, you know, Bruce, if you take the issues of Texas paper money and you put them all in date order, you can see the seat of government move. Because the seat of government moved from Washington, Nebraska to San Felipe de Austin, to Harrisburg, to Galveston, to Velasco, to Columbia, to Houston, then to Austin, then back to Houston, back to Washington, Nebraska, and finally to Austin, where it is today, all in a 10-year span. And you can trace the movement of the seat of government through the money that was issued. And Dr. Winders looks at me and goes, man, I never thought of that. That's got some really good educational value. He said, maybe you ought to take some of your notes and think about doing a book. Yeah. But over lunch, we were talking about that. And we had this exhibit in the Alamo. And at the time, I think they were averaging about 200,000 visitors a month. And if this was going to be a companion book for a Texas money exhibit, now they're still trying to find the funds to remodel the space, but that's a whole other story. But that was the genesis. No joke for Phil Collins, but that was the genesis of us, you know, getting there and writing this book. And as I went deeper and deeper and deeper in the subject, trying to finish the whole thing in 2 years, I realized A, it was going to take longer than they thought to build the exhibit space. But B, the story was far more deeper and interesting and complicated than I originally imagined. So it took on a whole new meaning.
And I think the result, the Paper Republic, the book is, I mean, I really cannot say enough how much I enjoy it. I look at it regularly. Anytime I'm doing some type of research on that kind of early Republic period, I always see, well, what is the kind of economic story behind what we're looking at, whether it be land distribution, building ships, or whatever it might be, the Texas Navy, the money, you can follow the money, just as you said in your introduction. And so one of the points that you make is that the money and credit was absolutely crucial to the development of the military and government of the Republic. Right. How did the revolutionaries actually fund the revolution? In the past, you mentioned that they taxed, begged, borrowed, robbed, cheated, and stole. Can you talk a little bit about these efforts and kind of what you mean by that?
Well, you're right. And that came verbatim right out of the text. They did it by taxing, begging, borrowing, robbing, cheating, and stealing. They issued taxes against property, but they didn't have any ways to collect them. They didn't have any. It's very difficult for them to collect, so that wasn't going to work very well. They did it by begging. They sent emissaries to the United States, and they solicited donations for the Texas cause. That was reasonably selected. Borrowing was thought to be the most expeditious way to raise large amounts of money. So the provisional government of Texas did borrow. They did arrange $250,000 in 2 different loans, which were negotiated in New Orleans. They didn't raise all the money because the second loan, the loans weren't funded all the way, but they did raise about $70,000 back then. Now that went a long way in 1836. They did it by robbing. They confiscated goods and fences and cattle and whatever, and they just pressed it into service for the good of the state. They did it by cheating. I say cheating, and the cheating didn't come till much later in the paper, in the implementation of the paper money system. And the stealing was the outright confiscation of any property that they could use to go into the war service. So that's a lot of how they did that. You had asked about schemes to finance the loans. One of the most outrageous was the Texian loans. The Texian loans were negotiated by 3 emissaries, Stephen F. Auster, Branch T. Archer, and William Wharton. And they went to New Orleans in January of 1836 to raise $200,000 for the benefit of raising the Army and the Navy and the sailors and the Marines and so forth. They went back and forth, and one of the lead negotiators, Robert Triplett, was an old friend of one of the New Orleans bankers, and they quickly gathered steam. They said, "What if we borrow this money, and we'll have a 5-year, 8% loan that's convertible into real estate in Texas land at 50 cents per acre?" And that was the selling point. Now the sticking point with the government when they got back was the lands had been set aside for the soldiers. They gave them headright certificates for 3 months or 6 months of service in the Texas Army. But they raised $20,000 that first weekend, which was 10% of the full $200,000 loan amount. And then a second loan was done for $50,000 8 days later on July the 11th. And what's so important about that is they set aside land in Texas for the repayment of the loans. The problem was Texas did not have title to the land. Mexico had title to the land. And first they had to defeat Santa Anna's army to get the land before they could take it and pay those loans off, which by any stretch, those would be considered speculative.
They wanted to raise about $200,000, correct, in
Yes.
New Orleans. About for perspective, about what would that be worth today?
Well, the first $20,000, a lot of that went to a warship. One of the warships, the Liberty, was bought for about $12,000. The schooner Invincible was bought for about $12,000. You couldn't buy you can't buy a brand new fiberglass boat for $24,000. I mean, you can't. But they were able to buy wooden ships and outfit them and arm them, and the pay was about $8 a month.
So you talked a little bit about how they used the land to really kind of, I guess, act as actual something you could actually touch to kind of back up their promises. Can you talk a little bit about how land was used as payment and how it was used not only to pay for paying soldiers, but also to really kind of back up the promises that they were making?
Land was, with few exceptions, you're in the land office, you probably know a lot more about this, but the soldiers, when they enlisted, they signed up, and part of their compensation was $8 a month plus a headright certificate. And the headright certificate would be for 640 acres of land anywhere they're choosing. And it may have been 320 acres or 640 acres, depending upon whether they're single or married or enrolled for 3 months or 6 months. So, there's a little bit of variation there, but these are the ones we've seen. That was the same thing. Okay, you're going to get land in Texas. Okay, Mexico had title to all that land. Texas didn't have title to that land. The impresarios, Stephen F. Austin's colony, Burnett's colony, DeWitt's colonies, they were Mexican land grants. They had parceled out those lands, so they could take any of those unappropriated lands, but those land grants came from Mexico. When they say these soldiers came here to fight for Texas, they were literally fighting for a piece of it. Davy Crockett wrote home, "I'm headed to Texas and I'm going to get me some land." And he was coming here for the land, got caught in the wrong place. Bad news. But his relatives got the headright after the fact. So they used that as an incentive for people to come in. They wanted the free land. All they had to do was survive the war. A lot of them didn't.
Whenever I read through your book, you make the transition from the revolution to after the revolution, it's time to actually govern. But it's hard to govern if the coffers are empty.
Right.
So when reading through the Paper Republic, it kind of seems like the whole system is built on a house of cards. If not everything goes exactly as planned, the entire thing falls apart. And then everybody, Sam Houston, Lamar, is kind of standing around saying, well, what do we do now? Which I imagine they were probably doing anyways. Maybe not together, though. Can you talk a little bit about some of the early challenges that the Republic faced as far as its finances are concerned, and kind of talk about the fragility of the entire system, and kind of talk about that?
Well, they kept that. That's a good question. They did keep excellent records. If you go back, I mean, the first serial number one was an issue for Gonzalez for incidental supplies to the Army. That one is held at SMU. So you go from serial number one and you go into serial number like 110 or 117 at San Felipe de Austin. Those still exist. Even when you go up to, in Washington, Nebraska, they always had these serial numbers on these treasury warrants. And the treasury warrant was a check. It was a government check. The last time I sent in a Texas gasoline tax refund, I can file that with the state comptroller and send in my gas receipts for gas I put in the boat. They sent me back a treasury warrant. And the number was like in the billions, but they still had a number on the treasury warrant from the state of Texas. You guys, the land office might get your checks electronically deposited, but when you see the paper one, they still call it a treasury warrant, right across the top. So the treasury warrants were the first obligations, and it's important to realize that it was a treasury designed to accrue liability. So it was on the liability side of the balance sheet. Somebody would contribute a wagon to the cause. They'd write him a treasury warrant for that. They couldn't cash it because there was no checks there. Or somebody else would make a donation. We donated a horse. They didn't donate the horse. They got attached to their animals. But if they donated a gun or a wagon or buckets or shovels or whatever, they would accrue a liability when they go to pay for that. The fragility of the financial system is probably easier to understand from the point of view of the recipient. Let's say you have a soldier or a farmer or a man on the street, and let's say they fought in the Texas Army, whether or not they're San Jacinto or Alamo or rear guards or whatever. So they're issued a military pay certificate for $48 for 6 months pay in the Army. That's his pay for military pay. He can't cash it. There's no banks. He can't cash it. So he exchanges that in probably something else that may have been owed to him at the treasury window. And he goes to the treasury window and he gets a treasury warrant. So this is the government check, but there's no banks in Texas. So he can't cash it. And so he had all this money out there lying around, and people said, okay, we want to get paid. So they're pounding on the door to Henry Smith and Sam Houston. And Henry Smith, of course, being the Treasury Secretary. So the Congress authorized $500,000 in star money, the star notes, the first printed currency that was issued in Houston and paid to 10% per annum. So they authorized these printing of these 500,000 star money to pay the outstanding liabilities. So some of these warrants that people got in San Felipe or Washington or Harrisburg or in Velasco, first they had to exchange the military pay certificates for a treasury warrant, for payment of the military, which is the most common. And then they go to the treasury office and they exchange that, and then they get paid. So they get the star notes, and the star notes pay the 10% interest. So they cash in the warrants, they get paid in the star money. Then he goes to a store. It could be a liquor store, it could be a dry goods store, it could be whatever. And they buy something for the house, and the merchant takes the notes. But the notes are only good for 1 year, because at the end of the year, they're redeemable to get the 10% interest. So you want to turn it in at the end of the year to get the 10% interest. So those got replaced by the government of Texas notes. The government of Texas notes are called the engraved notes because the engraved design was much more difficult to counterfeit. So those notes are outstanding for a year. And you wanted to turn those in at the end of the year because then you got the 10% interest. Well, by this time, Lamar's in office, and he instructs his Treasury Secretary. He tells him, well, make the notes near as national as possible, but strike out the interest. So this is where you had the photo of, or the image of Jeff Smith and Stephen F. Austin on the $5 and the $50 bill. So they're national. They got Texas emblems and the Lone Star and all that, cool design elements, but they no longer paid interest. So what you had was paper, chasing paper, chasing paper, chasing paper, chasing paper. And this stuff was all over the Republic at this point. And that's about the time that I figured that out. I said, I'm going to call this book The Paper Republic.
While you were talking about that, I started thinking about, the gold standard historically backed up the paper money. And then today it's just the good faith of the American government backs up paper money. And back then, I guess, it was just kind of, people were just kind of believing something was, they were just kind of believing that the star money was worth something, or did they think that even back then that it was really not worth a whole lot?
Well, that's a good question. It was a limited appropriation of $500,000. And there's one of the stories I had in the book where Henry Austin, a cousin of Stephen F. Austin, had some of the star money, and they made a journey on a steamboat to New Orleans, and the rumor got out that the Congress was going to pass another $1 million in issuing star money and dilute the currency. Well, they couldn't get 47 cents on the dollar. It dropped that quickly just in the rumors going from boat to boat. Turned out Houston squashed the rumors, said he was never going to have anybody them issue any more star money, and the currency recovered. But they had the fear of that, the flooding of of currency into the market. But that was the only money that was here. There were no banks in Texas, primarily because there was a law on the books that a state chartered bank, a bank to have capital, they had to have a $25,000 in specie as a capital base before they could form a bank, before they could go into business. And specie is gold and silver. None of the bankers were able to raise $25,000 in gold or silver as the capital requirement, the minimum capital requirement to start the bank. That's why we didn't have this here.
And so I think about at the end of 1836 or so, well, definitely at the end of 1836, Stephen F. Austin signs the charter for the Texas National Bank and Railroad, TRNBCC or something like that, which I think would have been the first bank and first railroad in Texas. And that kind of seemed like a very kind of speculative scheme at best, considering that it would be another 20 years before there were any railroads in Texas. Can you kind of just briefly talk about some of these schemes to develop any kinds of banks in the state?
Well, I'm not aware of Stephen F. Austin's involvement with that railroad, but given that he died in December of 1836, if he was the driving force, that may have died with him.
Yeah.
The Commercial and Agricultural Bank of Texas was one where the paper notes were actually printed, but they were never issued into circulation for the reason that they never were able to meet the capital requirement. You see some of those in the collector market, but that's the only other one I think that was being formed that never made it.
Okay. So one of the most interesting aspects of the Republic of Texas to me is Sam Houston and Mirabeau Lamar kind of trading spots as president. And so they seem to look at everything from opposite ends of the spectrum. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot right now, can you talk a little bit about the difference in kind of financial policies that the two may have had, and why Houston so much wanted to be annexed, while Lamar really wanted the Republic to stretch to the Pacific? And how did money factor into all that?
There's just two things about the Texas elections I think that are really important. Number one, Lamar was vice president to General Houston when he was elected president, and you don't necessarily the president, vice president in that first line, they weren't of the same party. They weren't of the same political party if we had those then. And they had bitter clashes. It is just as if when Lamar got president, he wanted to undo just as many of Houston's policies as he could. Houston was a very tight-fisted conservative. He wanted friendly relations with the Indians. He wanted to not stir the waters against Mexico, and he wanted Texas to join the United States. The other thing that was interesting about the Texas presidents could not run in consecutive terms. Houston served 2 terms, but by law, they could not be consecutive. So they had this fight, going on and on and on. And Lamar, like you said, he wanted independence. He saw this grand scale, spend whatever it takes, and let's keep Texas independent.
You mentioned the Texas Navy, and I believe they ran into some troubles in New Orleans and New York ports. And I believe that they caused a certain amount of financial damage somewhere along the way. And a lot of it had to deal with the Republic of Texas not being able to pay its debts.
Well, part of that, it's a good point. Part of that was rogue naval commanders that had no fiscal responsibility. The Texas warship Liberty, which escorted the Flora, which took Sam Houston to New Orleans for medical care after the battle. The Liberty's captain, George Wheelwright, put it in the shipyard and said, "I need new sails, new paint, new this, new this." And boy, the carpenters and painters and sailor, they swarmed over the ship. Then they went to the Texas consul in New Orleans and Texas agents. They said, "We don't have any money to pay for this." So the harbor master had to put the ship up for auction, and they sold it. They lost that warship, for that very reason. And then the Brutus and Invincible took which is also First Texas Navy. They took a side trip and said, "Oh, let's go to New York City." So they went up to New York City. They ordered a whole bunch of provisions, which is way more than they could pay. And then Sam Houston got a hold of Samuel May Williams, and Samuel May Williams went up to New York and had a gentleman named Swartout. They placed a bunch of loans with him. He loaned the money back by Texas land that freed up the ships. They brought them all the way back to Texas, and then they fired the two captains as soon as they landed here. It was a mess.
So we're coming up close to the amount of time that we booked for you. So we're going to start landing this plane pretty soon. And so there's only a couple more questions.
Sure.
Really, I can't encourage people enough to go pick up the Paper Republic, because there are so many different topics. Each chapter could easily be a 30, 45-minute conversation, but we won't do that to Jim. There really is so much interesting content in this book. And because of that, I'm curious, what do you hope that the impact of your work will be?
Well, that's a good question. I wanted to keep it alive. I wanted that story to be alive, because when I was doing the book, and I have a copy editor, her name was Carly Cale. She was a Bright Sky at the time, and you get to know your copy editor as you go back and forth. And one time she just says, "I've been reading Texas history all my life, and I've never read anything like this." Because it just took her down a new path. I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Well, most historians are not financial people. And this is the first time I've ever seen the whole financial side." She goes, "Oh my God, it is a story all in itself. And it's fully illustrated." And Bruce Winders said in the forward, although a lot of people are not expecting it, there's a lot of drama in this tale. And there was a lot of drama. There is a lot of drama in that story. So, but I think it's important to learn what can go wrong if you have fiscal irresponsibility in government, if you have crooked politicians. And boy, I had several people read this and they said, "I thought the politicians we had these days are crooked. You go back and look at those guys. Man, they were crazy. They were just, yeah, they're all dead. They can't defend themselves, but it's all there in black and white. When you go through the whole story of the annexation and the debt payoff and what happened after Texas joined the U.S., they didn't settle the debt of the Republic of Texas until the administration of Theodore Roosevelt. So, yeah, it is. Thanks for the kind words. It is an epic story. It is entertaining. And there's a lot of anecdotes that I just tried to take the reader down a path that maybe they never thought about before.
I was just, before we got on, I was just looking at the epilogue of the book, where that's titled "Up in Smoke," and it talks about the burning of the stone Capitol building, and how there was a lot of old Republic of Texas money that was burned in the process.
They were stored there, yeah.
And someone along the way collected a lot of the burned cash, and at some point, there were, speaking of crooked politicians and whatnot, You mentioned there were cases of politicians actually grabbing the money and then selling it on the collector's market at the beginning of the 20th century.
A
And
couple of
I
them
found that
were
interesting.
a couple of either state representatives or they were county treasurers. And, all the stuff was stored in the back of a county office and they were selling it to collectors. And yeah, it was interesting. Joe Olson and I kept coming across these letters on state of Texas letterhead for these people offering to sell this and sell this and sell this. And, but you couldn't get caught as easy as if you did it on the internet. So I guess it was a stamp here and a stamp there, but it's interesting. It adds to the colorful. We're all human, and we couldn't get along without politicians, but everybody likes to make fun of them. I guess it's just part of the job.
I assume that there must have been some piece of Texas history, whether it's a document, a map, a gun, a dollar bill, or whatever it might be. And you mentioned earlier it was a teacher for you. Can you talk a little bit more about developing a love for Texas history and why you think that's important?
Well, after I got out of elementary school, I went to San Jacinto Intermediate School, which was named for the victorious battle over the Mexican army. I live in Houston, Texas, which was named for the hero of the General Sam Houston, and our president was named after Sam Houston. My son went to Mirabeau B. Lamar High School. Okay, it's all around us. It's all around us. Austin, where the land office is, that was named in honor of Stephen F. Austin, who was the father of Texas. So it just goes a long way. And being born here and being raised here, I thought it was fun to collect Texas money. And then all of a sudden I got way off into the deep end and writing the book. And I was talking with my friend Greg Dimmick, who's a great historian himself, who wrote the book The Sea of Mud and just got a couple of others out. And he says, yeah, did you feel like you were going in and you were we were way over your head? And then he finishes my sentence and says, yeah, and you realize you couldn't back out because you were so far in it. I said, right. So, we shared that common history. But if I look at the work that Greg Dimmick did on the excavation and the military artifacts of Texas, I looked at some of the great work that Stephen Hardin did on the military history of the Republic of Texas. And I looked at the work that John Jordan did on the Texas Navy. And I did a lot of this money part. No one can cover all of those areas. We all need each other. There's overlap between one discipline and the other, but that's where, as historians and students, we learn is from others that have an expertise in a whole different area, but there's overlap and commonality with all. So you've got to look at all the pieces there. And I think that helps us grow.
As a collector of, I'm going to sneak one more question into you. As a collector of Republic of Texas money and early statehood money, if I'm at a garage sale or antique shop, what's the one piece that I should be on the lookout for?
The piece that's of interest to you, the one that grabs your eye.
All right, that's a good answer. So I would like to thank James P. Bevill, author of The Paper Republic, The Struggle for Money, Credit, and Independence in the Republic of Texas, for spending time with us today to talk about Texas history. His book is available wherever it is that you purchase your books, whether it be Amazon or anywhere else. Jim, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, James. Glad to have you guys on.
To everyone watching, on behalf of the Texas General Land Office, thank you once again for joining us. We'll be back next time this week in Texas history. On behalf of Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office, thank you once again for joining us here. We'll be back next time with more This Week in Texas History.